Okay, so we talked about Philip and Nathaniel, right? And what was the deal with them? What's that? Yes. Uh, we talked about the calling of the disciples and the timeline that we're looking at. We talked about the timeline that John has established in this section, that he's talking about those occurrences are taking place. We talked about where John fits that in and his purpose. And you remember that he's writing, we can, I think, safely assume that, yes, ma'am?
Oh, and the time. It was like, is it 10 o'clock? Is it 4 o'clock? Is it 10 at night? Why does it matter? But he says it later on, and he doesn't use his name, but he remembers it. So it's important because he remembers that day.
Wow. That's my daughter. Uh, no more sugary cereal for her in the morning. Okay, yeah. There was a discrepancy in the time period. She is absolutely right. And in my opinion, although even at the bottom, and Raymond pointed this out, that in his Bible it says 4 o'clock. And I disagreed with that. And some of the commentaries that I looked at disagreed with that because of the occurrences and because of the timeline that John uses later on seems to be Roman time, not Jewish time. And the audience that we look at that he's speaking to seems to be a Gentile audience, because he explains, as we might get into today, well, we'll get into some of it today. He explains Jewish practices to his audience, right? And in doing so, that leads you to believe that they're not familiar with Jewish practices, which would mean they're not Jewish, which would mean that he's writing to a Gentile audience, which would mean that he's probably going to use Gentile time, not Jewish time, as opposed to what other author might have used Jewish time. Matthew probably used Jewish time because his audience seems to be quite evidently Jewish, right? Mark, on the other hand, is writing to a Roman audience, we would assume, because of the way in which he writes. Okay, so we talked about the calling of the disciples and whether they were, in fact, this is the same calling as the synoptics, and we talked about the fact that it wasn't the same calling as the synoptics, and we talked about a little bit about the fact that that this is along with John's itinerary, right, in this gospel, that he is focusing in on. His emphasis is on the deity of Christ, right? And so he's talking about Nathanael's response to Jesus seeing him under the fig tree and saying, truly I say to you, heaven will open, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. We talked about the allusion that Christ is using to Jacob's ladder and him being the mediator, right, between God and man, and his use of Son of Man. And what was the significance in that respect? What's that? His humility and his humanity, right? Because he has already been referred to twice in these passages as the Son of God, but he refers to himself as the Son of Man. Okay, so this week we're going to go into, and I appear to have lost my notes already. That's amazing. And they were right here. Let's see. These could be them. Yep, this is them. Okay, so this week we are going to look at the wedding in Cana, and it is a very popular as far as preaching goes. There's a lot of sermons on the wedding in Cana. So we're going to start at verse 2. And we're going to read down to verse 12, and we might get into the cleansing of the temple. Okay, so on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw out some and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Okay, so I want to bring out first is the contrast that we see between the ministry of John and the ministry of Jesus. And one of the big contrasts that you see is where was John's ministry? It was outdoors, right? What did you say, Henrik? In the wilderness, right? So John's ministry was out in the wilderness. And where was Jesus' ministry? What's that? At the parties, yeah. Yeah, that's not where I was going with this. Okay, so John's ministry is out in the wilderness, and Jesus' ministry is in amongst the people, right? He goes into the populated areas, and he goes from town to town and from city to city. Now, here's a question. What's the difference between the ministry of Israel and the ministry of the church? Israel was a come and see ministry, right? Israel was separated. It was separate from everybody, and Gentiles, the people of the world who wanted to experience God, went to Israel. The church is a go and tell ministry. It goes into all the world and shares the gospel. And you see that difference. John is the last of the great prophets of the Old Testament. He is part of the Old Covenant. And so he has a come and see ministry. And all of Jerusalem came out to see him and to hear. And Jesus is a go and tell ministry. It is the start of the church age. And we're going to emphasize that more as we look at this transition. And remember, where John is writing in the church age. And so he is looking at that transition from the age of Israel to the age of the church. Okay, so there was on the third day, and we'll assume that the third day was a travel time, right? From where he was in the ministry in Bethany across the Jordan to where he is at Cana. He travels there, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now, we talked about that also. We talked about the fact that Mary is not mentioned by name in John's gospel, right? The emphasis in John's gospel is definitely on who? Jesus, right? And probably, and I'm not saying for sure, but probably by the time John writes his gospel, there's already starting to be an emphasis put on Mary that is not healthy for the church. And that obviously goes on and on to this day. Okay, but the emphasis is on Christ. And I like some of the commentators struggle with Mary's role in this wedding, because they struggle with it because she talks to Christ, right? But she also seems to have some rapport with the people at the wedding. Now, that they indicate that she has an integral part in the wedding ceremony and that she has some authority at the wedding. And that might be true. That might be true. However, I'm married to Laura. And if any of you know what my wife is like, when we go to events and there is anything that happens, she is in the thick of things right off the bat. And she will direct people that she doesn't even know to do things that she wants to help. She wants to help with taking care of things. So if it was at one of her relatives' weddings, which this is probably Mary's relative, my wife would, if it was her relative, she would take over, right? And she would give direction to people and they would listen to her in a way that would be, I would never presume to do. So in my opinion, Mary is a guest and she's shown up and there is a problem that she gets wind of and she wants to take care of it. She wants to help out, and that is a characteristic of Mary. Mary has a compassion for the problems of others. And I would say that is presumption on my part, but I think that's a fair presumption to say that Mary wants to take care of people, and she approaches the person that she knows can take care of matters. Now, Mary has a rapport with Jesus. She travels with a fair amount. She has raised him, and she knows him. She knows the significance of him, right? And so it is not, in my opinion, very unusual that she would approach Jesus on this matter because she knows who he is. And so the wine is run out, and I'm sure you all are aware of this situation. The celebration is huge, and the prestige of a wedding in Eastern cultures is massive. And if you ran out of wine, that would be that would paint your family, paint that relationship for the rest of the relationship, right? That marriage would be tainted as the one, oh yeah, they're the people that they didn't have enough wine at the wedding, right? And it would be a huge faux pas, a huge embarrassment for them. And so Mary approaches Jesus, and when she hears that the wine is run out, and she says, they have no wine. And Jesus says to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? Now, there's a couple of things we know, I'm sure, that the address of woman is not a derogatory term, but it's also not an intimate family term either, is it? Right? So even though we want to protect the dignity of Mary by saying, he didn't say, hey, woman, hey. We also should be aware that that was not a usual term that a son would give to a mom, right? And that's important to remember too, because one, there is an established relationship between Jesus and his family that we saw at the temple when he was 12, wasn't there? And how does he address his family when they go and find him in the temple? Right. So he has a relationship with his family that's already established because he refers to God as his father, and he is already well aware, even at the age of 12, that he has a separate responsibility to the father. Right? We see that in the temple because he is unapologetic about the anxiety that he's caused his parents. Now, he obviously still honors his father and mother, as the commandment would say to do, but he also understands who he is and his role in his ministry. The other thing is that what has just taken place just prior to this? The baptism, right? So the baptism is part of this anointing and this preparation of his priestly service, right? And so when he gets to this point, he is in an official capacity, right? And so there is a relationship difference now that hasn't existed before between him and his mom, and he's got an official role to play. He is not just there to take care of people's whims and needs and problems, right? That's not what he's there for. And so when she puts this upon him to take care of this situation, he's not necessarily going to take care of this situation on the basis of, listen, every time somebody has a request, I got to do this. I have a job to do. And so his relationship is one of a professional dealing with his family while they're on the job, right? Do you understand that? Any questions about that? Because like when you're a politician doing a job, does a job in the official capacity as that politician, and when their family comes and makes a request of them, they have to see it in light of who they are and what they're doing. Is that not correct? And so Jesus' relationship to his mom has changed now that his ministry has officially started. Okay, so he says, what does that have to do with me? Now, the other thing, though, is that in the Old Testament, in Proverbs 3:27-28, it says, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it to you when you have it with you. So Jesus, even though he's in his official capacity, one, his mom has made a request. So obviously she holds some sway with him. And two, he has it in his power to do good to these people. And the request has been made. So he is obligated to do this. And now when it says, what's that? Oh, okay, so his mother understands that. Mary understands that. She says to the servants, and these are not slaves, these are just servants, waiters. She says, do whatever he tells you, because she understands that Christ is not going to deny her. Okay? And there are 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. Obviously, that also indicates that it's Gentile audience that John's writing to. And each holds 20 to 30 gallons. Now, I don't know if they were empty or if they were partially full. The indication I get from it is that they were empty, and if 3 of them are like a 45-gallon drum, my kids know what it's like to fill the ones for the animals for water, so that's a lot of water, right? And she says, do whatever he tells you, and he says, fill them to the brim, and they do. And then he says, one of the things that they talk about that they were filled to the brim is that there was nothing could have been added to them. Now, let me tell you, and anybody who's drank wine knows that if you put a cup, 2 cup, let's say they were only filled 2/3 full and you put the rest with wine, right? Is that going to be wonderful wine? No, it's going to be terrible, right? So this is not a matter of that they were filled to the brim and nothing else could be added. It was, I think, a quantity matter, not a quality matter. But anyways, so they take some out and they bring it as requested to the master of the feast, and the master of the feast tasted it, and now the water, the master didn't know where it had come from, but the servants did, and you all know the story, right? That this is good wine and not bad wine. And this is definitely wine and not grape jelly or watered down wine, which you may have heard in response to that Jesus didn't drink real wine. There was a custom of mixing water with the wine. That's a curse in the Old Testament, but there is that idea that the custom of the Jews to water down the wine to prevent drunkenness. But there is a definite difference between good wine and bad wine, right? And it has somewhat to do with the alcohol content. And so it is important for us not to water down the meaning of Scripture. Christ drank wine. He didn't drink grape jelly mixed with water. This was definitely, and Romans knew good wine, and this was in a Roman culture, and the Jews understood that there was good wine and bad wine, and so this wine was good wine. And so when they bring it to the master of the feast, he says that everyone serves the good wine first and then the bad wine, and we all understand what that means. It means that once people's senses have been dulled by drinking the good wine, then you can bring out the cheaper stuff, and nobody's going to notice the difference, and it's not that big a deal. Okay. So one of the things that I want to draw your attention to, though, is this was not obviously a random occurrence, and it's not an occurrence that John brings out just for the fun of it, right? All of the things that John is bringing out, this particular first miracle has significance because of two things, right? One, it has significance in terms of the fact that it is showing Christ's power over creation, right? He creates new wine in this instance. And so it is displaying his glory. And if we understand that the significance of the emphasis of John is on the deity of Christ, this is emphasizing his glory. He is the Lord of glory. As John's going to bring out that this is about the display, the revelation of Christ's glory, and this miracle, the first, and John is very selective about the miracles that he's giving. Obviously, Christ performs tons of miracles throughout his ministry. There's lots of healings, right, that go on in his ministry. But John has selected out these particular ones. One of the things, though, that the second point is that it takes place at a wedding. And what is the significance of the wedding in terms of the New Testament? What's that? Right, the church is the bride of Christ, right? John the Baptist is seen as the best man, right? And Jesus is the bridegroom. And the significance of this, of the location of this, and this occurrence is that Christ, this is a picture of the up and coming marriage of the Lamb, right? This is the picture of that Christ is the bridegroom come, and he is the one that is ministering. And so the significance of it at a wedding is important because this is yet another instance of the emphasis, the transition to the church age, right? That Christ is the bridegroom. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that, as the Mormons do, that Christ is the bridegroom at this wedding, which is a Mormon teaching, right? Obviously, he is an invited guest, as it states quite clearly here. There is lots of ways to refute the Mormons' idea that Jesus had a bunch of wives, and this was the first one, and that after this he married several other women. It's a ridiculous point of view, but it is what it is. Okay, so my hour has not yet come. Now, there's lots of ways to look at that and interpret what that means, right? I would say that probably the best interpretation of what that refers to is that we've gone from the anointing and preparation at the baptism of Christ's ministry, and now we're going to move into what is the next occurrence here? The next occurrence is the cleansing of the temple and the Passover. So I would say that Jesus is going from his anointing at the baptism to the cleansing of the temple, and that is really the significant start, right? And this is kind of an interim period. And so his time is, the timeline is that he is going to start the ministry at the cleansing of the temple, and this is not part of that sequence, although in terms of sovereignty of God, it's definitely part of the sequence. But Jesus is referring to, okay, I have been anointed, now I'm going to go and cleanse the temple and have the Passover and then start my ministry. And so that this is not part of that sequence of events, but it is significant, obviously. Okay, so that is the wedding of Cana. Anybody got any questions on the wedding of Cana? I mean, it is. We're well familiar with the story because it is like a popular story, and so there's lots of symbolism on the number of jars and that people have gone into, and again, I think that's looking at. You get into a dangerous category. We talked about that when we were talking about proper hermeneutics, and when you start the subjective kind of putting into the text, the eisegesis, you get into a very dangerous position. There's nothing wrong with looking at what could be and putting it out as what could be. The problem is when you say what is, right? And I find that there's lots of Bible commentators and pastors that will present something as what is when in fact it's conjecture. And that's a very dangerous place to be. Okay, so we're going to go on to the cleansing of the temple, and we're going to start at verse 13. Yes, go ahead.
The part, and his disciples believed in him. What's the significance of what?
Okay, I actually had that down and didn't go over it. Okay, so the belief, it already says that they believed in him when John gave his testimony, right? So that's a good question. What is the significance of the belief now as opposed to the belief then? And what would be the significance? What's that? Affirmation. Right. So what has taken place? Jesus performed a miracle, right? So they're going from, okay, we accept the testimony of John on this basis, right? That he's given this testimony, but it is simply going on. He said it, and we believe it. We've talked to Jesus. He seems convincing. John seems convincing. Cool. We believe. Right? But then we have this miracle at the wedding, and that is an affirmation of his messiahship, right? That he is the Messiah, and he is the prophet, and he has performed this miracle. So we've gone from believing on the basis of testimony to evidential belief, right, in the lives of the disciples. And you'll see that over and over again through the Gospel of John. He talks about belief a lot, and there are those who believe without saving faith, right? There are tons of people who believe in Jesus, tons of people. and lots of people believe about a Jesus, right? So you have the Muslims who believe in Jesus, and the Mormons who believe in Jesus, and the Jehovah's Witnesses who believe in Jesus, and Oprah Winfrey who believes in Jesus, right? You have tons of people who believe in Jesus, but they do not have a saving faith in Jesus Christ, a faith that trusts in him for the salvation of their sins in accordance with who Christ is. They do not have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So that is the difference between the believing one of a testimony and an experiential belief, and in the belief on the basis of evidential belief. You understand those categories? Good. Okay, now we'll move on. All right, so the Passover of the Jews was at hand. Okay, we did touch on that, Kelsey, while you were going over your COVID stuff. Okay, so the significance of this first was what? Wedding. Right? Right. It's a wedding. We're looking at a transition to the church age and the significance of Christ in his relationship with believers. And a wedding is incredibly fitting for that, right? As the first venue of his ministry. And so his first miracle here, and John, as I said it before, John is emphasizing this transition, and I want you to see that in the cleansing of the temple. Okay, so the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen, sheep, and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there and making a whip of cord. He drove them out of the temple, and the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered what was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Okay, I want to stop there because we only have like 5 minutes left. So we'll just cover that one. One, in the Old Testament, it is allowed that if you came from far away, you could come and you could buy your sacrifice. That was not illegal. That was not a problem. The problem was not really that the location, although the location plays into it, but you could, at the temple, you could buy these things. And since the Jews refused to use the Roman money, they insisted on using the shekel. You had to do an exchange to get a shekel, right, to buy these things. So you brought your money. It was probably a drachma or whatever, and you had to exchange that for the shekel. Then once you've exchanged it for the shekel, then you have to buy your sacrifice. It's a little complicated, but there was two real problems here. One is there's a huge emphasis in the Old Testament on you don't take advantage of your fellow Israelites, right? They're coming to worship God. This is not a business. And so when they come and they want to buy their sacrifice and they want to exchange their money, you're not supposed to be swindling them to make money off them. The other thing is where they had set up was in the court of the Gentiles, right? And they had filled up the court of the Gentiles, and the purpose of the court of the Gentiles was what? What's that? The court of the Gentiles was so the Gentiles could come and worship God. If you've got a huge market set up, is there a lot of space for the Gentiles to worship God? Now there's significance. The court of the Gentiles is filled up, and it prevents Gentiles from coming to worship God. What does Jesus do? He cleanses out the court of the Gentiles. What is the church age? It's when the Gentiles can come and worship God. Jesus' cleansing of the court of the Gentiles is significant from the perspective that he is making a way for the Gentiles to come in and worship God. Not that there hasn't been a way already. Obviously, the court of the Gentiles exists. But he cleanses it out, and then he's going to do it again at the end of the ministry. But significant at the end of the ministry is the curtain is going to be torn in half. And so it's not simply that the Gentiles can come in, but they can go into the very presence of God. We can go in to the very presence of God. That is amazing. And Christ does that for us. The other thing is that, you get an image sometimes that Christ went in and like a madman, he went in and saw what was happening in a big rage. He just drove everybody out, turned over tables like a madman. Is that what happens here? No, what's he do first? Right. He takes time and he weaves a cord together. This is not an act of crazed, of impulsive rage. This is a very controlled act. And this is important, especially for parents who discipline their children, right? It is absolutely wrong to discipline your children in rage. There's a difference between anger, right? When you're angry and when you display anger to your children, as you should sometimes, that what they have done is angering because they have done something so impious that it requires an angry response. It is not wrong to be angry, but it is wrong to be out of control. And when you discipline your kids when you're out of control, that's abuse. And that is wrong. When you discipline your kids in self-controlled discipline, that is not only permitted, but required. Okay, we're done.